Welcome to the 4 p.m. work session for Lynchburg City Council on today, June 25th. And so we are going to do a switch of the agenda right now because I believe we are possibly waiting on one of our presenters for the first one. So if it's okay with council, we will start with hearing a presentation regarding roundabouts, the benefits, detriments, costs, and savings. And I believe that's Mr. Newland coming forward.
So that's a roundabout way of saying you want us to make a motion to change the agenda?
That would be awesome, yes. All right. Thank you. All right, Mr. Newland. I got you.
Good.
Lighthearted for 4 o'clock, that's good.
Help. Help.
This is the what?
Oh, I'm left clicking on
it. Presentation to us today, just out of curiosity, because there's a slight difference between the two.
There you go. I'm sorry? Good afternoon. I'm going to give you a short presentation, although I'm supposed to make it as long as I possibly can, about roundabouts. So
We're waiting for our speaker to arrive from the airport. We had a little flight issue regarding the blueprint for opportunity, so that's why we flipped.
So, roundabouts, benefits, detriments, costs, and savings.
It's never going to go. That's good.
I just had to add that in there. I'm sorry.
I'm going to try to give you all an overview of the appropriate placement of roundabouts, some of the benefits, some of the detriments, and kind of compare roundabouts with signals and stop signs. Roundabouts, where should they be used? Well, you can look at them. A lot of times they are used where you have high crash rate locations. The left turn movements are a prime example that you have large accidents that you try to reduce with roundabouts. And intersections with large traffic delays, usually the ones under about 30,000 vehicles per day. Single lane roundabouts will take up to 20,000 vehicles a day with a peak hour volume of about 2,000 to 2,500 vehicles. And multi-lane roundabouts will handle up to about 50,000 vehicles a day, but my personal opinion, I think that's a little too much for roundabouts. The biggest benefit with the roundabouts is the safety. You get the most benefit out of that, and it's mainly, I'll get to it here in a minute, it's because of the crashes. Traffic calming is benefit, increased operational performance, environmental benefits, aesthetics can be considered a benefit, and ongoing operations and maintenance costs are lower with roundabouts. Back to the safety in the traffic. There's been numerous studies, and they have shown that significant safety improvements at intersections when you convert to a roundabout. The biggest reason is, well, let me get to the numbers here first. 89% reduction in fatalities, 76% reduction in injuries. Equals out to about a 35% reduction in overall crashes. The reason that they are safer is because on a typical four-legged intersection, you have 32 conflict points. It's 32 locations where cars have a chance to collide with each other. On a roundabout, you reduce that to 8. So if you reduce the number of conflict points, you reduce the chances of accidents or crashes. And obviously, y'all know I'm not the transportation engineer, so I use old school accidents when the technical term is crashes. So if you'll hear me interchanging those. The physical shape of the roundabout is why you can reduce the number of conflict points, because it's more of a merging situation instead of a crossing situation. And because of that, you reduce the head-on and right angle crashes. Angle and left turn crashes are the most severe of all crashes, and they result in 63% of all the fatal crashes. Roundabouts can be considered, some people call them slow and go intersections. You slow down and you go. You don't have to stop. The roundabout, those crashes are more side swipes, so you once again reduce the severity of the crashes and therefore injuries. Environmental factors. By reducing the number of stops compared to a signalized or an all-way stop control intersection, you improve your drive time, and your average delay for the signal is about 12 seconds per car, and a roundabout is less than 5 seconds per car. So you keep the traffic moving. And by reducing the stops, you improve the air quality, reduction in noise, reduction in fuel. Aesthetics, you can put landscaping in the middle, make the intersections look better. You can use them as a gateway into a community. And sometimes they're used for traffic calming. You use them to change the difference from a commercial to a residential area. They're a good separation. Ongoing operations and maintenance. The operating cost is less, and usually that is due because of the electricity that you have to use for signals. You don't have to have them on roundabouts. Less technical hardware, less signal timing equipment. So like I said, roughly saves about $5,000 a year annually. The public savings, that comes from the reduction in crashes. A Washington State Department of Transportation study had that 1 gallon of fuel saved per 365 vehicles per day that goes through a roundabout. At the Oddfellows and Mayflower roundabout, with the number of traffic that's on that road per day, which is about 20,000 daily traffic is what VDOT predicts. You save about 55 gallons of fuel per day, which ends up being $50,000 per year at $2.50 a gallon. What are some of the detriments to roundabouts? A lot of it is that the drivers don't know how to drive through roundabouts. It's confusion. They're not familiar with the traffic pattern. Another detriment to the roundabout is the size of the right-of-way that's needed. Roundabouts require more land. Usually it's about 150 to 200 feet for the circle, excuse me, compared to about 75 feet for a intersection. Emergency vehicles priority on traffic signals here in Lynchburg. Most of them we have the Opticom system, which gives the emergency vehicles the right of way. It turns the signal green, lets you move through. You don't have that in a roundabout, obviously, because there's no signal, but usually traffic is not backed up. It's continually moving through the roundabout, so you don't have that anyway. A big detriment is bicycles, and that's especially in the multi-lane roundabouts. They have a hard time merging in with the traffic. Usually it's better if they stop, get off their bike, and walk them through the pedestrian part of it. And then roundabouts really can't be used in progression corridors unless they're at the beginning or the end. Progression corridors like what we have down on Ward's Road, where the signals are timed and move people through regularly. Cost comparisons. The initial construction of the roundabouts does cost more than signals. And then you get into operational, roundabouts cost less per year. Environmentally, they cost less than the signals due to the air quality and the reduction in fuel use, the time that you take to get through there. And then, like I said earlier, safety is by far the major benefit to the roundabouts. That's where they get their large cost-benefit advantages to signals. In Lynchburg, recently, cost for roundabouts. The Logan's Lane roundabout that went in there at the ramp as you get off of the expressway up to Timberlake Road, it's about $2.6 million. The Liberty Mountain Drive roundabout that was just paved out on 460, that was a VDOT project. It was a revenue sharing project, but that cost $5.99 million. Both Oddfellows Road and Park Avenue, both of those roundabouts were part of a larger project, so I really don't have those broken out as the cost specifically for those. And the considerations for the roundabout, you know, the right-of-way, a lot of it depends on the size, or if you already have the right-of-way available. Conceptual design is a big cost consideration for roundabouts. Usually you're early in the process at the application stage that we have been discussing previously at budget meetings. You know, you've got high contingencies in them because you don't know what you have. You've got unknown utilities that can be major. You got drainage. You may have to chase it for a ways to get away from the roundabouts. The environmental quality, you may have to put in more of a, either buy credits or put in ponds, and landscaping. All that is in the conceptual design unknowns that you have to account for. The funding sources, VDOT requires certain elements in their estimates that we usually don't have to have in our own estimates. And if it's funded through VDOT, then they were requiring us to have those. If it's federal funds, there's an additional cost for paperwork that you have to do, and it's running roughly about 35% for paperwork and reporting for the federal requirements. And then inflation. Obviously, a lot of times when we apply for them, with the funding is several years out, 6 years or so out, like on the smart scale projects. Speaking of smart scale, if you went back through the last round here that were recommended for funding, there are quite a few roundabouts in the program that was funded, and the costs in the applications are listed here. Most of them are running right around $6 million, probably is the average of all of those, all over the state. And that's about the end of my presentation. I will be happy to answer any questions. I tried to slow down there at the end.
Councilmember Helgeson.
I guess it's, you know, as you just had that last one with the cost of the roundabouts.
Yes, sir.
And so, you know, as the costs of different things go up, in economics, people have different choices, you know, and so you pick something different. And so if the costs are $6 million for roundabout, and maybe that is the average cost for similar roundabouts, I think that is why you then kind of look at, you were saying about the utility of the project, or any project, to say, well, I think much better utility, and I'm very glad that our local folks said, hey, we're going to be able to move that $6 million on a roundabout that has probably very limited utility, very limited traffic problems and data and crashes, and put it in a place where we know it is. And so if those are the costs, eventually then you have different choices. You know, for example, when the cost of, you know, any product goes through the roof, you pick something different. When petroleum goes up, you use other, you know, things. So hopefully as we're dealing with our budget that we're gonna, especially in light of the fact that we're approving our minutes tonight, and Robin, by the way, thank you for all these detailed minutes. During our budget, we talked about one of these roundabouts, the original one on Fifth Street was $250,000. You know, so it's a long way from here. If the costs are up, fine. We just don't have to do them, you know, so.
Councilmember Pero.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for bringing up the Fifth Street roundabout, because I don't think that roundabout could have been $250,000 based on the fact that, you know, what we're seeing for costs is significantly more than that, and we were told that the bulk of the costs on the Fifth Street job, which was a good job, was utilities, and that the roundabout was just kind of an add-on to it. And at $250,000, I could see that for being an add-on, but was that was that the real cost? A couple other downsides to roundabouts that I've noticed. I think that they're very effective for moving traffic. It's obvious to me the benefits of them, but some concerns that I've seen, because I use the Fifth and Federal roundabout every day almost. It's very challenging. I think we need to look at a better way to move pedestrians through roundabouts, because it's startling. You cannot see the pedestrian unless you're the first car going through the roundabout. If you're following a car in a roundabout and the pedestrian's coming across and that car stops in the roundabout itself. And because there's not enough room for a car length between the pedestrian crossing and the pedestrian crossing and the exit of the roundabout. So I've seen some people lock up trying to avoid the pedestrian, or at least the car behind the car trailing the lead car, coming to an abrupt stop, because you're not expecting somebody to stop in the roundabout itself. Also, the truck turning area, I'll call it, where the wheels of the truck are supposed to carry over. It's part of the road. At the Fifth Street roundabout, it's brick. Unfortunately, that's an attractive nuisance. I like the brick. I think it looks great. But with brick sidewalks, people think that that's a sidewalk. And it's obviously not. There's no way to get there. But I've seen people walking in the middle of the roundabout all the time. And so that's it. We've got to figure out a way, if we're going to continue roundabouts, we've got to figure out a way to make sure that is clearly not a walking area. Sure, please.
The first one we built in the city.
Oh, of course.
And I think we have learned from that. If you look at some of the ones that are built later, the one at Oddfellows Road, the one at Park Avenue, we don't have brick in the middle. We've got stamped concrete, so it doesn't look like a walking area. And the pedestrian crossings have been pushed back from the roundabout so that you do have that space in there where you can get at least one car between the crosswalk and the roundabout going either way, so that it opens that separation up.
I have been through the Park Avenue one a lot, but the complaint I've heard about the Park Avenue one is you have to go all the way around to turn right, the signage, and that's a little.
Geometry.
If you're in a car, you can do it, but certainly a truck cannot.
Correct.
And people are worried that they're violating something if they went ahead and turned. But to me, that's clearly a truck indication or a large vehicle indication. Or maybe I'm just choosing not to ignore the sign. Lastly, what does a stoplight cost now? I know you're not the traffic engineer.
Stoplights are in the 250 to 275, 250 to 275,000 for a replacement of a light that's already been in there.
Okay.
New construction, you might have turn lanes, so that it kind of varies quite a bit when you have new construction.
But it sounds like significantly less than the $6 million. So
It is less.
I think from a policy standpoint, we need to, as Mr. Eggleston said, look at the utility, understand that there are considerable savings on an annual basis to the public. 10% of those savings are savings to the locality, necessarily the public funds. We just need to be mindful and look at, from a fiscal standpoint, what is the most responsible use of funds. Granted, you do have the environmental the environmental benefits that you brought up. I think there are some also aesthetic benefits, and I can't remember the rest of them off the top of my head. Safety, yes. I think you just need to weigh it, but I can't. It's so hard for me to think that it's cost $6 million to do a circle of asphalt with some curb. And I know you've got inflation in there and everything else. It's just hard for me to get my head around it. Is that a hard number? The $6 million or the 5.99, is that a hard number from the contractor for the Oddfellows Road?
I got that number by calling VDOT and asked them what the cost was. I did not get into the actual details of it. The 2.6 for the Logan's Lane is a definitely hard cost number on that one.
I wonder how much roadway section two-lane road, or maybe even four-lane road, you can get for $1 million. Or you get probably 100 yards. But it's certainly not a lot. But, I mean, just to put it in terms of miles how many miles of road could you get for $6 million for the cost of the roundabout? So that's how I'm trying to compare it. And I know you're going to get less than one, most likely.
And I guess then that's why I tried to get these in here that shows it all over the state. That's prices that they're putting in for the roundabouts for these applications.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's the city of Lynchburg problem. I'm thinking it's a bigger issue. But I'm just disappointed that they cost that much because it seemed like a neat solution.
If I can add on that, when you mentioned about the environmental savings, if you have one nice roundabout that you spend $6.1 million on, and then all of the rest downstream or upstream up the road isn't, you're then going to offset any environmental savings with the loss of savings because you didn't improve those interchanges, if that makes it, because you spent all of your money on $6 million on one interchange rather than having lights where people go through and, because if you get through a roundabout and then you got to stop at the next stoplight for, 20 minutes idling, that really didn't save anything. All you did is you got through the roundabout quicker to get to the stoplight to sit and idle there. So, so.
In other words, you could extend the project to encompass more with the same dollars.
Yes, you could get people going. Just like some of the items that they did just with the traffic signalization project that was done a few years ago on Wards Road. Oh, that's great. Where you can kind of, and I realize you got to reset that thing all the time, but, for a while it works great. And then it's, a little difficult, but.
If I could wrap up with this, I guess from a policy standpoint, it'd be nice if we had kind of an understanding of what the goals were with that specific project. If you're extending a road and you're looking between a roundabout or a traffic light, do kind of a cost-benefit analysis between the two, just instead of automatically defaulting one way or the other. Or I guess what we have been doing is more defaulting towards roundabouts. Is that an inaccurate statement?
No, VDOT, their recommendation is to look first at roundabouts. Try to put a roundabout in an intersection first, and then if it won't work, look to the signal. That's their recommended procedure.
I think as we move forward, following VDOT's recommended procedure, we should look at the roundabout, but also have the alternatives in line and look at the cost benefits between the alternatives. That's all I have, Madam.
Thank you. Councilmember Wilder?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate it. I had such a question about roundabouts, especially since they've been developing over our community lately. I'm still trying to understand the roundabout on Atlantic Avenue by Wards Road. To me, it's so, maybe it's just me, I'm somewhat challenged when I get to that roundabout. It seems like maybe it's just me. But again, I appreciate the information. Again, going back with Councilman Perro, I do have a question about the cost. I was just still trying to get my head around $6 million for a roundabout. I was just trying to understand that. At some point, do you have like a breakdown of that $6 million? Is it just utility work? Is it the asphalt? I'm just trying to get a better understanding of that $6 million.
And I had my notes when I was here for the budget session. I don't have them now, but I'll try to remember what I had. The cost of the roundabout, I believe, was like $3.6 million, $3.5 million for the construction of it. And then by the time you added the contingency on top of it, because it was early in the process, and then by the time you added inflation, and by the time you added the cost for a federal funded project, each of those jumped it up. Contingency at that stage is about 20-25% because we haven't really done any design. The federal money was 35% increase on it. The inflation is about 3% per year compounded out is what we use. So it jumps it up fairly quickly to get up to the $6 million that we had in the.
Because it's federal funds, it jumps it up. I got confused there. I'm sorry.
The reporting requirements, the additional paperwork, the additional items that we have to do to meet the federal requirements or federal regulations, that testing, they require more testing than we normally do on air projects. All of that adds up to about 35% increase on projects if it's federally funded.
Thank you. And also, it's good to understand that VDOT recommends a roundabout prior to like a stoplight or other considerations. So is that?
They recommend looking at that first, yes.
Wow, great. Thank you for the information. Appreciate it.
Councilmember Helgeson? And then-
With regarding Sterling's question about the cost, I thought you put in here that there was a big chunk that was for right-of-way acquisition. Is that not you didn't mention that?
Like I said, I don't have my notes with me. It very
Is a
well-
lot of it because of right-of-way acquisition, or because you have to get so much more and you're, not just more property, but maybe people understand that, hey, this is gonna come here and you gotta pay, more than top dollar? Or is it because of the bricks and mortar the concrete that you're putting on here?
I mean, right-of-way is part of the cost. If you're referring to the one that we were talking about at Langhorne Vassar, I know there were some right-of-way costs involved in that one as well, yes.
When you say some, like a lot, or is it just a 10% or pretty inconsequential?
All that varies on the project. And I don't have my notes on that one, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. and Thank you, Mr. Newland. You gave an insightful summary of roundabouts in Lynchburg and this area. I appreciate what Councilmember Helgeson and Pero are saying about the relative costs and balancing that off against what could be acquired and produced if you went a conventional construction approach. But I think it's a little bit, at this point, a little bit careless to slap a price tag on any roundabout using a $6 million figure. We certainly don't know what the characteristics are of those other roundabouts on that list throughout the state of Virginia. I do recall that, and if you look at Logan's Lane, that's $2.6 million. Now, a lot of that was already property I think the city already owned when it acquired the restaurant that was torn down. So and there was going to be a ramp, a reconfiguration of that ramp anyway, so maybe that's the reason that figure is artificially low, because the roundabout component of the cost was relative to the whole project itself. I do also recall, and I don't have my notes, but when the 6.1 million figure was previously announced for the Langhorne Road Vassar project, a whole lot of that was acquisition simply because of the topography of that intersection at the top of a hill. It would drastically impact a house that's below grade, a very nice piece of property on, I think that's Randolph Place and Langhorne Road, and then also would impact the retirement home and take a substantial portion of their front yard, in addition to the engineering challenges. So that is so unusual model that I don't think that would be characteristic of a roundabout anywhere else. So I think it's a little bit hasty to just slap a $6 million price tag on roundabouts and say that's what it's going to cost, in my mind, simply because each one has its own merits and each one has different characteristics and challenges. And some are small, some are larger. But to wrap it up, I don't want to labor this point because we're not dealing with any decisions today, but are there any considerations for building a roundabout in any street in Lynchburg that would not qualify for federal or state funding? My assumption is unless it's a high volume intersection, most streets that would end up having a roundabout would be on a highway that would qualify for both, which would involve reimbursement.
Yeah, I know that like the one that Mr. Wilder was talking about on Atlanta Avenue, that was a mini roundabout. That was done without state or federal funding. That was done all with local funding, and that was because the pavement was so wide open, the room was already there to be able to do it and didn't have to have any additional right-of-way, didn't have to have a lot of additional curb and gutter to get that one in there. And there's another one that we're working on out on Yorktown and Atherholt, which is the same situation. You have a lot of open pavement and it channelizes the traffic and makes it progress in a more uniform manner. As far as a large roundabout, the one at Fifth Street was done without federal funding or state funding, and the one at Logan's Lane was revenue sharing, so it was half state funding.
Well, the one proposed for the bottom of Indian Hill Road, that certainly is not a $6 million roundabout.
That is
And that
also-
would,
I'm
and,
sorry.
and that's not going to be reimbursed in any way, would it?
That's also a very small mini roundabout.
Right.
And the numbers were about $7,000, I believe, additional cost to be able to build that roundabout over putting in the pavement back like it was.
So that's my point. It, you can't classify as a roundabout and then slap a big price tag on it because each one has its unique characteristics.
That is correct, just like an intersection that Mr. Parrott was talking about too, you know, depending on if you need turn lanes or what, that each one is different, yes.
You had crash data in there, and that was just the national.
Yes.
Do we take a look at our own crash data for the intersections that it's put into?
We use crash data to determine if it's a high crash location. That's usually why we are looking to do something like a roundabout. The Vassar Langhorne is a high crash location within the city. So that's why it was being looked at. Another one is that was also in Smart Scale that didn't get funded was at CVCC Campus Drive and Wards Ferry Road.
So do we go back and look for when they're placed in there? Did it actually do what it was supposed to do, or is that not a fair comparison because it's different?
We haven't had that situation really yet.
These are not high crash, they're high cash roundabouts now.
Yes, Councilmember Wilder.
So there is going to be a roundabout at Harvard, I guess, or is it CVCC Campus Drive now?
That was a application that we also submitted for Smart Scale. It was not recommended to be funded. The Langhorne Vassar had a higher cost benefit ratio, so that one did get recommended for funding. We asked to move it over to the Smart Scale project, the 501-221 project instead.
So is that going to be a project for the CVCC portion? Is that going to be a project for later on, or?
It's still on the books as a project that, yes, needs to be.
And was that estimated cost on that one? Was it about $6 million?
Yes, it was very similar. It may have been 5.9.
Is that, if we could just, at some point, just get more of a breakdown of that happened, just so I can understand it better, as far as is it land acquisition, is it the materials, that thing, just get a better understanding of it, a visual learner.
This was a really helpful discussion from a capital improvement program improvement process. When you look at our CIP pages in our budget document, typically we list construction and design as our two line items. In the future, we will do our best to break out what land acquisition and right-of-way might cost as well.
Any further questions or discussion?
If I may just real quick.
Oh,
So
yes,
one
sorry.
thing we learned during budget this year was about the need to do some more objective analysis on prioritizing various projects, as we all know. So I was pleased to learn that Public Works for some time has been working on developing a quantitative tool to figure out where those dollars ought to be spent. We'll be presenting that to PDC for their consideration July 9th as we consider various projects as we go forward. So these are the types of projects we want to look at, and cost, of course, is certainly one component of that, but also safety and aesthetics and a variety of other things. So we're pleased with that.
Just as you mentioned, was that the Vassar Street one scored higher than Wards Ferry Road? I mean, when your average person thinks about whoever travels on those roads, a whole lot more people are up and down on Ward's Ferry Road than they are ever going to be on that last little stretch over there at Vassar. And so that maybe that'll be an interesting thing to say how that happened to score higher, just because somebody's looking at something more objective that says it's close to a hospital or something, as opposed to traffic data and crashes and whatnot.
That was a smart scale score?
That was a smart scale score.
Yeah.
That's
and
voodoo,
the
man.
Yeah,
crashes.
yeah, so, yeah.
You're right. Madam Mayor,
Yes.
maybe I would
Councilmember Para?
suggest that we take a brief recess while waiting for the next item. Or do
If
a
it
roll
may-
call now?
Maybe do roll call, and then
Is
if
there
it
a-
doesn't come here, they can start. It's not,
Oh,
He'll be here within the next 5 minutes.
oh, very good. Okay, so we can begin the present.
You could do roll call maybe, and then.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. All right, we'll do roll call. We'll go a little out of sync. Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you. No items.
All right, Councilmember Para.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've actually covered most of, or my items with staff, but I've been thinking about a policy perspective that I think we need to take a look at. I'll mention this tonight also, I believe, but it doesn't appear that the city's policy is conducive to R1 development, new R1 development. And I've heard a lot about the need to have single-family homes, but the city's policy, in effect, doesn't allow the developers to do those homes in a cost-effective manner. We require too many things: the curb and gutter, the sidewalk, the paving, street lights, and that is, from what I've heard, is just prohibitively expensive. So therefore, they have to ask for R2 zoning. And when was the last time we saw an R1 or a single-family housing development plan at all? I don't recall one. So I think we'll need to take a look, or at least have a presentation from staff in a work session at some point about what is required for an R1 development, and is it prohibitive or not? And staff may want to consider having some developers speak to that as well. I think it'd be a good learning thing if we're told, or if it appears, and it seems anecdotally anyway, that it's not. That basically we disallow R1 development due to the cost of the development itself, then we may want to that's effectively our policy, and then may want to consider something different. So that's it.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I've had a developer too talk about hookup of water and some other sewer. Yeah, the cost of that. Thank you. Councilmember Helgelson.
thank you. And I appreciate Councilmember Pearl bringing that up, because tonight we have, going from R1 to R3. In the paper today, there was two of them that said, hey, we need to, on Leesville Road was one of them, need to go from R1 to R3 and put in like 80-some townhomes. Another one said we need to double the amount in there just to recoup and change the profit. Both of those are in the paper today, so I think that's good. I have a traffic one, and hopefully on Timberlake Road, obviously there's been a little bit of fixing of roads and whatnot. There's been a 35-mile-an-hour zone for a little bit of time, and hopefully that's
thank you for
just,
bringing that
it's a
up.
matter of going to be done fairly soon, I hope. It's hopefully by no means by anybody even remotely thinking that it's going to be permanent, I hope. So I hope it's just because of construction and they kept an extra 35-mile-an-hour zone in there. I've heard from quite a few people wondering about it, and sadly to see people kind of, almost, I think we've had some traffic, with some cops sitting there waiting for someone to come through there, which I don't think that's a good thing.
Can I add to
Yeah,
that? Because
absolutely.
I heard a lot about this also.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is if you're coming off the ramp, you think you're in a 45 because it's a 45 up ahead, but it's a 35 back by Heritage. So it's an effective speed trap. And people have asked for at least put a sign up where they can see it so they know if they're coming off that exit.
Because it's been 45 and it's worked great. I figured there's construction, so they're,
Yeah, or-
during that.
The 35, yeah. Makes sense.
Councilmember Wilder?
Again, we finished our graduation season, and we're so thankful for Heritage High School in East Glass, for all the great graduates, and the support we have through Beacon of Hope, and to see so many young people going to college. Even my fraternity on Sunday, the mayor was there, where our fraternity gave out over $7,000 in scholarships to African American males. We're just excited to see the community working together to make sure our children have access to college. So we appreciate the community working so good together. Thank you.
Councilmember Wright?
Mayor. So it was shared with me, just one item. It was shared with me the other day, the Virginia Legal Aid Society's report on evictions in Lynchburg, which I hadn't seen yet. And the report uses judicial data to show how many evictions are occurring in localities across Virginia. And in Lynchburg, our rate is 8.62% of renters are evicted, which is the 5th highest in Virginia. And our total number of evictions is the 10th highest compared to other mid-sized cities, so cities between 20,000 and 180,000, 100,000 across the country, which means, this is in 2016 data, that our number of evictions equals about 3.3 evictions per day. So I'd recommend to the council members, and I'm happy to share that report for them to see. Obviously, it sort of folds into our ongoing conversations about poverty, hypermobility, homelessness, overcrowding in Lynchburg, and so I just wanted to raise it here as something that obviously should concern all of us. So.
Thank you, Councilmember Wright. And just to echo your comment, it is something that the Housing Authority is looking at. The board members have been reading the book Eviction, and I believe Councilmember Pero, and he is the chair of the Housing Authority, but we've requested that they come make a presentation to the Housing Authority so that we can better understand their data, the Legal Aid Society. So.
Say one of the, I know we're not supposed to talk about roll call lines, but one of the data has a bit of a flaw in it because it only records the actual evictions, and a lot of times evictions, that's the court filing of it, and a lot of times it's reconciled at court or even before court. So we're going to dive into that data.
Right. All right, thank you. And I just have one roll call item, the Enough event. The next one is tomorrow evening. They start at 6 o'clock. It's going to be at the Davis Turner Funeral Home. It's the Daniels Hill event. So the public and members of the Rivermont community, council members, if you want to come out there, it's a great event. Our LPD, our Sheriff's Department, community, One Voice, One Community, all partner together. So it's a great partnership effort in reaching out to the community, and it's had some good results. So we invite everyone to come out there for that. And I believe now that we are ready for our presentation, I'll call Margette Upshur to the podium. Thank you very much. And this is to receive a presentation on the Office of Economic Development and Tourism's A Blueprint for Opportunity Anchor Institution Engagement Strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Madam Mayor and members of council. Thank you so much for your indulgence and allowing us to flip the agenda. I want to just take a second to recognize in the audience Rob McClintock, who is the Managing Director of Business Retention and Expansion. He's our regional representative for the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, and he's just been a wonderful, wonderful partner. So he cannot be at the presentation to the anchors in the morning, so I invited him to come here. Thank you, Rob, for being here with us. So we really appreciate the opportunity to give you all an update, and our presentation today is leveraging anchors for economic growth. As you know, goal 2 of the blueprint for opportunity is to strengthen the absolutely fantastic work that was, I think, started in 2010 by Councilmember and former Mayor Joan Foster and Councilmember Randy Nelson with the Town and Gown. I see this as just 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever that's up to now. We are looking forward to a meeting tomorrow. Stephen will give a broader presentation. We have 36 people coming to that event. All of our colleges and universities, as well as the healthcare system, will all be represented there tomorrow. So I'm just very, very excited. You all have been invited. And for those of you who cannot attend, beyond the presentation that's here tonight, the fantastic communications and marketing department has agreed to tape that session. So that'll be available for you all as well as the general public. So the presentation tomorrow is from 7:30 to 9:30, and that's in partnership with the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance. And so without further ado, I will bring Stephen Pedigo, who is our consultant for the Blueprint for Opportunity. And Stephen has recently been named a faculty member at the University of Texas. It probably has a much longer title than that. At the University of Texas, LBJ School of Public Affairs.
Thank you all for moving the agenda. I was stuck in the airport for about 5 hours today, but we made it. Good time to spend some time with you guys. I think I've met most of you actually before, I think, through the Blueprint process. I won't spend any time introducing myself, but as Margette said, I am actually leaving NYU. Many of you know that I was at New York University, and I'm going home to Texas. I'm going back to the University of Texas. I'm pretty excited about that. But I'm excited to be here to talk to you all a little bit about anchor institutions and the work that we've been doing with the Blueprint. I believe that you hopefully have a copy of the slides. If not, you'll get a copy of them as we go through the presentation today. So, as Margette said, really today's part of the conversation is to talk a little bit more about anchor institutions and build off the work that has been done in the past, and really sort of use this as a discussion, right? I mean, so I'll run through some slides, but I'm happy to answer your questions as we talk through this, and feel free to interrupt me as well. That's always as good. As good. And if I'm a little manic, it's because I just literally got out of the car and changed, and I'm here. But I am here nonetheless. The agenda for today really is, we'll do a few things. We'll talk a little bit about the Blueprint. And it's interesting that as we talk about the Blueprint, how many folks have reached out to me about the work that we did here as models for other small mid-sized cities. So I think that's a lot to be said for Margette and her team, and Anna and the folks at the Office of Economic Development and Tourism, and as well as the city managers team as well. We'll talk a little bit about anchor institutions, what they are, why they matter, roles and methods for collaboration. I'll try to give you some examples just to sort of contextualize a little bit about what we're talking about, and then talk a little bit about sort of the road ahead as well. Sure.
And so just in broader context from a strategy perspective, can you describe how this works within or in parallel to the cluster concept that we discussed about a year ago?
Yeah, I'm going to get all to that.
Okay, because when I was reading the slides, I didn't see that link, but
I'll get to it for sure.
Great,
no worries for sure. So again, remember we talked about the vision, this idea that Lynchburg, every resident has an opportunity to thrive, thinking about how business and clusters work together. I will get to your question for sure. Remember that we had set out sort of 5 key goals. The goal of 1 being expanding business opportunities. That's where that cluster piece falls into that. And what's interesting about the idea of cluster development is that's where anchors can play an important role in terms of acceleration of clusters. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we move. Goal 2, we deliberately pulled out anchor institutions as a separate goal, partly because you are a meds and eds town, right? I mean, a significant amount of your employment is concentrated in healthcare and educational institutions. And so this question about collaboration is important. Moreover, I think the reason that we want to think about anchor institutions is they are now playing a larger role in our communities. Everything from the idea of property owners to real estate developers to also this major employers. So this idea of how do you think about how to catalyze them as a way to drive economic development. The third goal, remember, was about talent. Again, anchors play important there. They play an important role in community and building a place, which is what goal 4 was. And then goal 5 was about this idea of story. But we're really going to center on goal 2 for our discussion today. So anchors, why do they matter? As we generally, anchor institutions is a really is kind of a clunky word, but really as we're talking about anchor institutions, we're really focused about universities and healthcare institutions, cultural facilities, large-scale real estate developments, and in fact, there's lots to be said now that even large-scale technology-type companies are playing a role of anchor institutions, as well as we think about the role that they play in communities. Why do they matter? Typically, as described by the word, they typically own a significant investment in the city, and really are not typically places that pick up and pull and leave. A lot of times, if you think about institutions like anchor institutions, a major part of their portfolio, or a major part of their asset is actually the land that they own, right? The real estate space that they own. They play a big role in impact in terms of revitalization. There is this key piece in terms of purchasing power. And then there is this question about shared value. So if you talk about this idea of cluster development, particularly as we think about the idea of healthcare institutions is a great example of this in terms of wanting to improve the types of products and services that you have or build out a healthcare sector, that anchor institution becomes that real nexus, right? That real sort of hive in terms of being able to drive that innovation as we go forward. So there is this real key opportunity to think about how we build shared value between that and communities.
I'm going to interrupt again because
Sure.
that's the slide that I had kind of keyed in on and trying to define what an anchor institution
Sure.
was. So it sounds like to me mostly nonprofits, where I've been thinking, for-profit business generations, but nonprofits that are hiring a significant number of people and putting a significant number of people to work. They're creating intellectual property or created drive. So that makes sense. But an institution, you're really thinking about some sort of public or quasi-public or open to the public, certainly,
That's
facility.
true. I mean, that's a very traditional example of an anchor institution. But I could put, I could push this definition a little bit further and say, look, if we look at, for instance, you recently probably heard about the Google investment that Google's doing out in Silicon Valley around affordable housing and playing a big role in San Jose. Or Amazon is a great example in Northern Virginia. Those absolutely will be anchor institutions, a different model of anchor institution, but same sort of roles that we think about. So if we go through the presentation, you'll see I've got this slide where I sort of identify roles. Private sector businesses, particularly large-scale private sector businesses, can absolutely play that role as well, for sure.
And real estate developments could be large-scale real estate development. So in this case, would Windhurst be considered
for sure. So much today that we've gotten to a point, right, where we think about city development where you're not developing cities by parcel, but blocks by blocks, right? So for instance, if you're thinking about a large scale development in terms of large scale, right, in terms of large development, we could absolutely think about real estate developments as anchor institutions. So for instance, I'll give you an example in New York. So in New York City, recently, if you've been to Brooklyn, there's a terrific new development that's went into Brooklyn called Domino Park, a large area that's been redeveloped in a public park, also with a lot of residential and housing around. Hudson Yards, the largest construction site in the world that we hear a lot about, right? That in itself would be considered an anchor-based institution as well, partly because as elected officials and folks that are playing roles in communities, we're starting to raise expectations to say, well, to give you an example, if you want to change in zoning, right, or if you're wanting to have a redevelopment plan of a large scale, well, what does that mean in terms of sort of maybe the community services agreement that you come back with in terms of large community? So for instance, that too can play a role in anchor institutions so much. I'll give you an example. Recently, Philadelphia City Council president, if you've been following this work like I do a lot, has recently said, if you're going to do any large scale development in the city of Philadelphia going forward, we'll have a community services agreement because you got to play this role of an anchor. You can't just be a real estate developer. You got to think about what are the other things that you're doing. Because think about it, right? We're dealing with the issues of affordability. Some of you mentioned homelessness, for instance, entrepreneur types of on-ramp types of things. All of those things are coming to say, well, we as a government can't do that all alone. We've got to think about some interesting public-private partnerships, and some of that is done through anchors, for instance. That really gets to this idea of the shared value, right? The whole role or the whole idea of anchor institutions has been about the idea that you want to improve, obviously, the institution, right? The institution wants to be competitive. We as a city want our institutions to be competitive, but also our anchor institutions care a lot about our community development because, frankly, the environment impacts them, right? Think about the example, which we'll talk about in a second, is the example of UPenn in West Philadelphia. One of the reasons that Penn played a significant role in the revitalization of Western Philadelphia was partly because of the idea that they couldn't attract students. And they needed the safety concerns. Drexel's doing more and more of this in Philadelphia, partly because they realize, the Western Philadelphia needs to be a safe place for students. Syracuse University can't get students to come up to Syracuse, so they're thinking about the revitalization of downtown, trying to get students to live in the downtown area as a way to think about how to improve that environment as well from a competitive standpoint, for sure. So again, if we think about anchors, they're intrinsically linked, right? Increased demand, that's one of the things that anchors really want to think about. We want to, if you are a supplier, if you're particularly an anchor institution, a lot of times you're thinking about how you improve your supplier network. Frankly, that may be the number one reason that a lot of times that for-profit anchors think about anchors. And then this question about the talent pool. Partly because there is this question about, are there gaps between our current workforce system and what employers are actually needing? And so employers are stepping up to the plate, particularly the anchors are stepping up to the plate to say, look, we're going to develop our own training programs, perhaps, in partnership with others, but also to sort of fill that gap. Again, thinking about that competitiveness as you go forward. So to your point and to your question earlier, you can think about anchors and having many, many different types of roles, and anchors don't have to play all of these roles, but can play some of these roles. Absolutely, we know that anchors are playing a major real estate development role. In fact, I always say that if you look at the university president's office, university president's offices do two things. They raise money and they do redevelopment. They are building things all the time, right? That's really what the key sort of the role of a university president is today. So this idea of real estate development, if you think that universities and healthcare institutions are large purchasers, right, in everything from catering to paper clips to healthcare services, right, outside services, they purchase lots of goods. Clearly, they employ a lot of folks. They do a lot of workforce development. But to your point also earlier, they also can be that cluster catalyst, right? So for instance, in Cleveland, which has done a really interesting job about bringing anchor institutions together, so not just operating together separately, but in partnership with each other in the city, one of the things they've done really well is think about how they catalyze the biosciences and health sector there around the Cleveland Clinic. So there's this economic development piece that plays an important role as well. Community infrastructure builder, obviously providing the core products and services. So,
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
That slide one more time. And I'm not interrupting you to challenge you or to ask. I think this is critically important for the city. So I hope you interpret it as actively engaged. On the previous slide, if you just go back one really quickly, and this really stood out to me when I was reading the slide, that it's not a philanthropic effort of the city to invest in economic development. It shouldn't be, is how I read that. It should be, just as I said, a strategic investment that's going to yield tangible results. And I thought that was a very good point that you brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, one of the sort of gurus who've thought a lot about this idea of anchor institutions and the role that they play has been Mike Porter at the business school at Harvard, and has said a lot that if you really want to actually build a shared value strategy, a corporate an anchor strategy, an economic development strategy, it's got to be able to have an ROI on it, a return on the investment, in which in terms of making, for sure. Anchors can act in three different ways. They can obviously act independently. I'll give you an example of that. They can act together, but in terms of partnerships, so perhaps your two healthcare institutions, perhaps maybe there's a shortage of skilled workforce that come together with a community college and build a health training program. Perhaps that's a way anchors could work together. But what's even more interesting now in terms of the world, where anchor research has gone, and what we're going to talk to the anchors about tomorrow, is thinking about how anchors come together to work together, not just together, but also in a larger sort of collaborative perspective. So they can act independently with other anchors and then as collaboratives. And so just some examples of this, the most quintessential organization that is probably the most written about anchor institution and the work that they've done is obviously the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia, launched in the 1980s, again, partly because of a student safety issue. It was a competitiveness issue for UPenn. Just to be blunt, UPenn was getting beat by all the other Ivies. No parents were wanting to send their students to West Philadelphia. So they launched the West Philadelphia initiative. with sort of several, 3, 4, 5 goals. One was improving neighborhoods, 2, trying to provide some housing for their residents, and then trying to accelerate the community development around there. So a lot of what happened with that institution was, 1, just doing some affordable housing for faculty, get faculty and students to live around the neighborhood and live in the urban area. So you can imagine that if you wanted to get more people living downtown, are there partnerships that you do with the university to get people to live downtown? There's another way to think about that. The university formed a bid district and funded a bid district to do the economic development and revitalization. And now what's very interesting about UPenn, and their work has advanced so far that I believe it's almost 50% of their purchasing now comes from within a mile around the zip code of where the university is. Think about that, right? And so just making a true commitment to hire, not minority owned, not just women owned, but locally owned, right? And so if we think about economic development, there's obviously a lot of economic development that talks a lot about the importance of minority owned economic development, supportive programs, women programs, but you could even take this a step further and say, let's do a place-based approach where you start to really put together some of your incentives and things to really to amp up your impact. And this is what the University of Pennsylvania has done as well. One of my favorite examples is the Cleveland Clinic, and this really is from your question earlier about the idea of accelerating of a cluster. Was really wanting to think about if you've been to the clinic, it's in one of the poorest neighborhoods in all of Ohio. They had really difficult challenges in terms of getting suppliers, also having real challenges with safety issues around their institution, but also just in terms of talent. And so have done a lot around improving the neighborhood. And much of the work that the clinic has done is now moved into the Circle Initiative, which I'll talk about as we go through in terms of talking about an anchor collaborative. So what are collaboratives? Collaboratives are really this idea of coming together, formulating goals. And so as you look at the blueprint planned, one of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow with the anchors are what is some type of goal that the anchor institutions along with the city could think about in terms of accelerating and advancing forward. And so the reason that much of the work has been focused on this idea of collaboratives going forward is because, frankly, just like government agencies and public agencies, budgets are tight. Leadership changes happen at the top. And there can be this limited impact. So if you're thinking about how to amp up your anchor institutions and you're looking for a city-based strategy, how do you connect different anchors across the city around a particular initiative? That plays an important role in terms of thinking about this. And then also just having the nonprofit and governmental and public sector to help catalyze it and move that forward. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So one of my favorite examples of an anchor collaborative is in Midtown Detroit, and a lot of folks have talked about the rebirth of downtown Detroit being the Dan Gilbert seminar. Dan Gilbert is the owner of Quicken Loans. You might know him if you're a basketball fan as the guy that owns the Cleveland Cavaliers and made some really bad decisions maybe. But he's also a pretty smart real estate developer and has done a lot of really interesting impact in terms of the downtown Detroit. But in addition to that work, has been the Midtown Detroit Collaborative, particularly really funneled through Wayne State and a couple of the healthcare institutions, which basically said, look, if we're going to revitalize the neighborhoods here, let's just do a basic incentive program for our employees to live within a walking distance around our institutions. That in itself can transform the neighborhood just like that, just getting boots on the ground, and really has played an important role in changing this initiative. In fact, this initiative has moved on just beyond just live Midtown Detroit to also buy Midtown Detroit as well. So as we talk about these examples, what are some examples in terms of things that can happen here in Lynchburg? And as Margette said, tomorrow I think it's a great first step in terms of bringing together a group to talk about what our institutions. So the first step that we're sort of thinking through at the beginning of this is really talking about this idea of anchor institutions and really what they are and the roles that they play, and that's really what part of tomorrow will be. The second part of this, I think, is us to provide a little bit of analytics around this, and as institutions that have not done this type of work before, helping them to think through what are some goal-setting tools and how are they assessing what they're already doing. The third is pulling this group back together to think about what is that collaborative, what are some key goals. We have positioned this idea of, can you even think about Lynchburg as this lab where you have institutions doing things together, and then obviously we know that the anchors here play an important role in terms of tourism. So what are we doing in the next year to make all of that happen? First, we're doing some workshops, just explaining what anchors are, collecting some best practices. I think it's important to catalog a lot of the successes that are already happening here in Lynchburg. There is a lot to be said. There's just not a story and a narrative behind it. And that's one of the things that we know as we talk about economic development, that's a key thing, right, is being able to tell that story and who that story is. Convene that group together to think about what are some community needs and what are some efforts, because it's got to really be anchor-led, and it can't just be sort of city-led. It's got to be anchor-led from a workforce, from a working group perspective. And then I know that one of the things that we've been tasked with is also to think about tourism development around this as well. So those are the things that we hope to accomplish in the next year. As you've looked at the blueprint, obviously the blueprint's very detailed, but one of the things I would say is Margette and her team has done a really great job of giving you a really deliberate action plan about what are the metrics and how they're going to build their resources as well as their activities around that, and that's part of this as well. So with that, I'll stop and answer any questions that you have. Hope it's been helpful.
Thank you. Who's first? Councilmember Wright, and followed by Councilmember Wilder.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And good to see you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for rushing for us. Appreciate it. So can you tell us
safely?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you don't have a lead foot. Can you tell us a little more about community services agreements and how they've been used across Virginia?
So I don't know. So that's you've given me a question I can't answer very correctly for you, because you add across Virginia. I could do a little bit more. I can tell you a little bit about community service agreements, generally speaking.
Yeah, I'm more or less curious. I am curious about how they're structured and the details of them, but also, are they legally permissible in Virginia?
That's a great question. I would assume I don't know. I would assume yes.
Yeah.
But I will know that answer as of tomorrow.
Okay.
But I would assume yes. I mean, most I have not actually heard of them being illegal, actually, or not permissible, actually. So that's a good question. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that about if they're permissible in Virginia, but I will find out.
Know what they are and
sure.
how
So
they've
community
worked,
service agreement. As we think about redevelopment, so we're living in the world of redevelopment. Everything is about the world of redevelopment at this point. And many cities are starting, particularly a lot of the larger cities that are strapped for resources, are saying, Mr. Developer or Mr. Wright, you're looking to redevelop 6 parcels of land. That's great. Unfortunately, you're not zoned for residential zoning. You're zoned for commercial zoning, or you're zoned for primarily maybe industrial zoning. And so if you are looking for a zoning change, or even that more so, if you're looking for a particular type of density, right? So you're wanting to build a particular type of density.
You're basically saying that, not totally the word, but saying, hey, if you want this, you got to give us something. And so with that, there's, the proffer elements are very tenuous in Virginia.
Sure, I may be
now,
describing a little bit informally, but
Yeah.
what we do know is cities are making, for instance, these changes with zoning changes and with density trade-offs. Lots and lots of places are doing this now, particularly to reach certain attainable goals. So, for instance, if we're talking,
The cities that you had in there are hopefully vastly different from Lynchburg. You had 3 of them that were, you mentioned that they needed the city in order to thrive and to grow, or to just even kind of continue. And
I
so
would say there's some terrific examples of anchors that aren't necessarily in terms of needing. Chattanooga, Tennessee is a great example of a city that was quite thriving, has a really strong university system there, and through an anchor collaborative have built the Chattanooga Innovation District. That's a terrific example of anchors playing a particularly important role. Again, we could go back to even some of the things that are happening in Virginia. If you look at the redevelopment, for instance, around Amazon, particularly what the state is doing with that, and or with the redevelopment of, even if you look around even suburban Maryland, the role of suburban Maryland in terms of some of the redevelopment that's happening in those areas. Those are absolutely with anchors that are playing roles, not in necessarily areas that are thriving, that are challenged. I would suggest to you that as we think about anchor institutions, particularly, they've become a much larger player in our communities today, right? We know that, for instance, just to give you, not to throw off a ton of research, but areas that have strong research institutions and strong universities and healthcare institutions have higher levels of inequality, just by definition. All the metrics would suggest it. And so one of the things that universities themselves Not necessarily because the city is saying it or because the government is saying it, saying we feel these pressures. We feel the pressures of the neighborhood groups around us. We feel the pressures of the organizations around us to say, look, maybe we have to do some more for the community, and that's a role that anchors are playing. But point well taken.
And so with all that, I think it just kind of stems back to just the basics of economics, and Adam Smith saying that most people are looking out for their regard for their own interest. You mentioned UPenn looking out for their own interest. You mentioned the Cleveland Clinic, and I had been to Cleveland when, I mean, it's crazy. I'm glad it's changed. Detroit, when they would do wholesale, revitalization by bulldozer, so institutions that we have here are looking out for their own interest, and I would hate to see us, the anchor term kind of flipped and being the anchor necessarily about their neck because they have got to do something for us rather than we can help them grow and thrive. So,
I totally agree. I think it is this question about shared value for sure. I do think that the role of community service agreements can be, if done correctly, even anchor institutions would say, many of the anchors that have entered into these types of agreements have said, what's great about community service agreements is that we know we build real strong partnerships with not only our neighborhood institutions, our government institutions, and there's a sense of accountability, right? There is a sense of accountability in terms of the types of metrics, et cetera, that are being sort of evaluated. But you are right? As you think about the role of anchors, generally speaking, to the earlier point, one of the things that makes anchors really so interesting is that, yes, it's about servicing your own issue, right? That's why companies do CSR, frankly, right? Let's just be real. But it is this question about thinking about the environment, and one of the things that we know from Economic Development 101 is that cluster environment really is important, and anchors play a role there for sure.
Thank you.
kind of jumped in. Sorry. Sorry.
I'm also curious, you mentioned a bid district. Is it
Business Improvement District.
Business Improvement
Special Improvement District. You do have them in Virginia.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks for anticipating that question. But can you?
I know Special Improvement Districts very well.
But can you? I imagine we.
I don't.
Have it here,
I'm not sure. Is your downtown association? It is not. Okay. So many cities have them. Virginia has them. In fact, Virginia has a lot of them, particularly on the Washington, D.C. area. Areas that are designated as special improvement districts, it could be a parks district, it could be a downtown corridor, it could be a neighborhood corridor. And a lot of times what can happen is the government can, or even institutions or real estate developers themselves, can petition to have a tax levied against it, right? Sort of a share of tax. Those dollars go to fund, typically could be a nonprofit organization, it could be a sole nonprofit organization, it could be a public-private nonprofit organization. Bid districts can be structured in many, many ways. But the way to think about bids is if you get at the neighborhood level, bids do all the things that we as our city government a lot of times can't do because of resources and because of people and because of time. And that is, number one, placemaking, which is about making neighborhoods great places to visit. Two, just cleaning the streets. So if you go out to New York City, for instance, if you come to the city, and you see all of the trash is nicely put together in the city, it's not because the New York City Sanitation Department did it, it's because the bid districts did it, frankly. And so there can be partnerships between cities and neighborhood groups, and then a lot of placemaking events. So if you go to parks or you go to a really nice festival, sometimes those can obviously be funded through bid districts as well. Yeah. And in fact, I would argue that we don't use, in a lot of cities, we haven't used bid districts effectively enough. To give you an example, how many have been to the High Line? The High Line in New York. The great example of the High Line in New York versus, for instance, the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston, where the Big Dig is the Big Dig has is funded through a public-private partnership through a bid district where it's done a pretty decent job of trying to do affordability, programming, et cetera. The High Line, one of the arguments for folks who say about the High Line is that you just let that neighborhood with that major public investment that the city did with no return on the investment in terms of thinking about how to govern it, created an organization that's had to be a nonprofit, that's had to continually fundraise, that's had to now the neighborhood that's had to deal with lots of gentrification and displacement issues as well. So lots of ways to think about that.
The High Line's elevated rail path through
Yeah,
the city?
yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And in fact, the guy that wrote Robert Hammond, who has become a friend and one of the founders of the High Line, said the biggest mistake they did was not think about the governance of the High Line. They got too excited about trying to invest in a public park and thinking about getting this old industrial space up and getting it through city planning and doing all the fundraising around it, but they didn't think about the longevity of it, the sustainability of it. And so it's now become a nonprofit that basically, like every other nonprofit across the country, and has to raise money every year.
So I don't know who has the next question. I know I have a couple of. Councilmember Wilder.
Thank you for the information.
Yeah,
Really
for sure.
appreciate
Thanks
it
for
to learn more about this. Just to make sure I can understand, as far as for the anchor institutions, are we also talking about ones who are already currently here, or inviting more to come into our community, or is it
Generally,
kind of
we
both?
think that's a great question. Generally, we think of anchor institutions as institutions that are already here. By the definition, right, they're anchored in. And so, again, that idea of healthcare institutions, universities, and a lot of reason that we have now become sort of focused on these idea of these nonprofit institutions is because we know many of these nonprofit institutions don't pay property taxes.
Would it also be used as a way of encouraging other businesses to come to your area, as far as relocating to this area, to certain properties that already exist?
For sure. I mean, if you think about anchor institutions from an economic development standpoint, per the earlier question about this idea of why, if you are an institution, why would you come to a particular area? A lot of times those anchors become that hive, right? That real catalyst. So give you an example. If you look at the Washington, D.C. area, right, as an example, or even Northern Virginia, why has Northern Virginia thrived? Well, everyone says, well, Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. has went through a complete renaissance. Why? Because they have the #1 anchor institution in the entire world. Anybody know what it is? The federal government, right? And so the government institutions, federal bases, when we go through, for instance, every few years when we go through the BRAC redevelopment, right, when Congress is going through the BRAC, or the Department of Defense, why do communities care? Because those are their anchor institutions, right? Those accelerate their economies. Huntsville, Alabama. If you look at Huntsville, Alabama, why is Huntsville, Alabama the #1 place for rocket scientists in the entire country? Well, because NASA and the DoD has a big place there. So they are those institutions that absolutely become the catalyst and the reason that businesses a lot of times will want to come and set up shop there. Absolutely, for sure.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. I guess my thoughts, and just kind of to echo or just
Yeah, please.
repeat maybe back what you said when I'm hearing. Anchor institutions have the opportunity to maybe support some local businesses or entrepreneurs in different ways as developed. Like, I do remember another city early on that the healthcare began to buy some of its items that it would regularly purchase from local businesses.
Just imagine if your healthcare institution, sorry to interrupt, said, look, we're going to set a 10% local buy goal, 10% local buy goal. What does that do?
Right.
Automatically creates the opportunity for small businesses, right? And that's not, I mean, yes, it's a challenge in terms of thinking about that supplier and going through that certification process and all of that. But again, we're not asking for any type of givebacks. What we're just saying is let's set some goals. Institution A or Institution B, let's say that we're going to buy 10% of all of our goods and services locally, 5-mile radius, right, within the region, not even within the city. You start to create some real opportunity for economic development. Yeah.
And also, I know one of the anchor institutions is already working on, or has worked on, the Community Health Assessment Survey. And so they have their own data and committees that are meeting. So is that something that can be kind of pulled into what we're talking about now as far as how they can help meet the need that they found in their own health community survey?
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back to that role of what do anchors do, one of the key roles that anchors do, one of the key things that anchors do is have a core product or service for their local community, right? And for healthcare institutions, a lot of times that is about the wellness and health of the local residents, right? Because again, thinking about the idea, what are the most important things to healthcare institutions? Local patients, right? Healthcare, generally speaking, outside of a handful of cities is what we call a local cluster, right? Meaning that the growth doesn't come from the idea of residents outside of the region. The growth of that business or that opportunity for that institution grows by attracting more residents or by the growth of the population of a community. So a healthcare institution wants to make sure that the vitality of the community is better, right? It creates more customers, creates more patients, all those types of things. Again, that return on investment piece.
All right. Thank you for
You're
that.
very welcome.
I'm just trying to tie some things together in
Yeah,
my
no, that's
brain.
great.
And also, will this be an opportunity for institutions or the anchor institutions to look at themselves and their own data? And what I'm getting to is that look at their employees who maybe are at a certain entry-level pay. Where are their zip codes? Where are they actually housed? And how could they tie their own data to some of the needs in the community? And I say that because I know an anchor institution, and I'll just give the example, that had an employee that was working every day and living in their car. And so, you know, while there are community resources, but if the anchor institution doesn't ask their own employee base or group, what are your needs? What is it that we can help with, or at least become a partner to make sure that our own employees aren't living in their car? And so that's the kind of thing I know I'd like to see kind of happen with the conversation. Not to mandate that they do anything in that instance. Individuals have their own responsibility. But if they're coming to work every day, earning a paycheck that's not affordable for them to house themselves, then that may be something that's an area they may want to help with in the community. So,
Absolutely agree. In fact, this is a big piece of my work now, is working with institutions that are doing this. Institutions are raising, as you all know, we're talking about, there's lots of discussions about the well-being and livability of cities, and institutions are saying, look, we play an important role for the people that work for us from a talent retention perspective, but also from an on-ramping perspective, right, in terms of being able to move people up the ladder. An institution that we're doing some work with is Jefferson University. And Jefferson is one of the largest healthcare providers now in the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And one of the things that they have done is looked at, it's a healthcare institution that is actually, it's interesting because it just went through a merger recently where it has pulled many of other institutions together to create the Jefferson Health System. And one of the things that they've done is recently looked at what are the wages that employees across their system are making, and they have committed to this idea of a $15 minimum wage. Not to say that is what all anchor institutions do, but it's something that they believe that was important to them. The other thing that I thought was more important than even just that was thinking about how you evaluate skill opportunities. So imagine that, and this is something that UPenn has talked a lot about in their work as they go around and work with other institutions. Imagine that one of the great things about anchor institutions a lot of times becomes those benefits that come along with it, right? So you get pretty good health care, you may get access to, if you're an educational institution, to tuition remission for you and for your kids and other things. And so one of the things that these institutions, particularly Jefferson, is looking at is how are their employees using those benefits, and are their employees working up, if they started as an admin, are they working up through the pipeline? And so there is this question about thinking not just about community assessment. Again, I'm an economic developer by trade, and so I'm always thinking about my clients are typically cities, and so thinking about what do you get for the opportunity, the return on the investment back to the city. But institutions are saying, look, this is important to us as well, the competitiveness for us in terms of talent attraction, particularly as you all know, at that associate level degree or that entry level degree is becoming much more challenging. And so a lot of institutions are evaluating those opportunities within. But yes, absolutely.
okay. And you mentioned a key word, gentrification, because
Which isn't all bad.
It's not all bad.
Yeah.
And that's why
I have to say that as a former real estate professor.
Right, it's not. And I mean, the ability to turn over neighborhoods and areas and that kind of thing, mixed income, business, retail is great. I just want to make sure we're having the conversation of when we go in helping, it doesn't mean helping to turn over totally economically, that it pushes people out. So I think the balance of all of this conversation we've had is important to, is particularly some of our core neighborhoods where for a lot of the anchor institutions, just generally, personally speaking, I know folks live in them that work in some of our anchor institutions, to make sure people can sustain and maintain themselves in the neighborhoods that they currently live in, if they choose to.
Yeah, and a lot of institutions are now doing that, right, in terms of thinking about faculty. Obviously, you all, if you, there was something in my email box today that Stanford is now committing $400 million to affordable housing for faculty and students, right, to think about how they dealing with some of the gentrification. There's an affordable housing spend to that as well. But I think your point is well taken. taken about the idea of thinking about gentrification. The challenge with all cities, right, and this is not just Lynchburg, but mid-sized cities, large cities, is that generally speaking, none of us really anticipated the return back to the city movement. Right? I mean, most data suggested, and this happened in 2000 slowly and accelerated really fast. And so we were not as, generally speaking, as city governments, as economic development officials, thinking about policies that should be in place. And so, in fact, if you look at the literature today, particularly in economic development, the real conversation is not around competitiveness. We all know what drives clusters, right? 101, it's about knowing your strengths, building supplier networks, leveraging anchor institutions. We all know that. The challenge for cities today is how do you manage the effect of growth? Right? How do you grow in a way where people can grow collectively together? And so this is the question of why the housing debate is happening. This is the question of neighborhood revitalization, all of these issues. And not to say that there isn't a market solution to this. I believe that, in fact, the only way you get this, I always joke that Mayor de Blasio says he's going to build the most affordable housing plan in the country. Yeah, but he's never going to build his way out of the affordability housing issue without having a really strong partner in the private sector that can play an important role in there. And so many private sector developers are saying, look, there is a role here if we think about how to do this in a way that can make sense. So there is a market solution to this as well.
Okay, thank you. That's all. Councilmember Nelson?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Steve, it's good to see you again. It's always interesting to listen to you and talk to you and hear your ideas and reports about what's going well in other places. I certainly am enthusiastic about what you're going to present tomorrow morning in an ongoing series, I hope. I, 9 years ago, was very interested in, as Margette said a little while ago, about creating a town and gown collaboration with the city. I didn't see it in terms of anchors and clusters. I saw it in the context of valuable resources and assets, having 6 colleges and universities in this area, and we needed to get that synergy going and with the city and with other businesses to make and maximize the potential. And you've given us some good examples of places where the anchor partnership has been effective. I'm going to turn that coin on the other side and ask you, are there instances that are worth discussing where strong anchors have partnered to the detriment of minority interest or those interests that are not part of the partnership? And I'll throw it for, I think Mayor Tweedy mentioned the gentrification aspect. That's maybe a component of it. But in Lynchburg, we've got 2 major anchors you've identified, an education component and a medical component. Both of them are nonprofits. Their assets, for the most part, in terms of holdings, don't generate real estate taxes and other taxes, although they do generate a tremendous wealth of revenue in other aspects. But if there are non-mainstream interests that don't comport with the partnership formed by those anchors, are there models that have proved negative in any communities that we need to be conscious of and not step on those landmines as we go forward as a city that might neglect other interests that become dominated by the anchors?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's lots of examples of different types of anchors or anchor institutions working in terms of their own to better their own environment with the expense of others at times, right? I mean, in fact, you could look at New York City. Columbia University is a great example of this, right? The redevelopment of Morningside Heights prior to looking at when the Bloomberg administration was in and basically said, look, you can't continue to do the type of development that you're doing around the neighborhood without having a new whole comprehensive planning process in place. You could look at my institution, New York University, has not sometimes been the best of neighbors. Where I'm going, University of Texas, I wouldn't say this publicly, maybe not sometimes the best. I may not even get to being on faculty if I say that it is made public. Have not sometimes been the best partners. partly bits because a lot of times what's happened is that and it typically becomes on two fronts. One is universities can be quite aggressive in terms of real estate development. And so typically speaking, a lot of times the folks on the peripheral of the universities are not as strong of players perhaps, and have for a lot of times not had much voice. Although, as we have seen recently, places are seeing much more organizing in the neighborhood level than ever before. Just talk to Amazon about that, right, in Long Island City. So that can play. Generally speaking, it's been a challenge around the idea of real estate, particularly around real estate development. And then again, I think the other thing to realize is that some universities just aren't good neighbors, frankly, right? I live in South Orange, New Jersey. Seton Hall is just a really shitty neighbor. They don't do much for the city. There's not even really a strong community services agreement, a fee-for-service base for police or fire, any of that. And that's partly just because there's not been very good leadership at the top. My argument today, I think, is, as I said before, university presidents particularly are becoming much more astute of understanding that there's pressures on them from a community development perspective, there's pressures on a government perspective, and then frankly, many students are now not just buying a university product, they're buying a city experience. So you ask my students why they're going to school. A lot of times they're not going to the NYU because of NYU, they're going to NYU because they want to live in New York City. Or they're going to the University of Texas because they want to be in Austin. Or they're going, it was funny because we had recently met with Governor Murphy, and he says, look, Princeton feels like for the first time as an Ivy League institution, they're having to up their game in recruitment because they're losing students to UPenn and other places. Kids are buying those city experience environments. So I think a lot of this about engagement with engagement starts at the top, and it has to start at the top. With a vision that is built around a collective vision for the institution, but also for the city, and really thinking about the reason I like collaboratives, or reason I think collaboratives are important, is because there is a sense of accountability, right? It's not one institution acting on their own; it's a collaborative of institutions that are holding each other accountable as well. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of the best practices in the space have said, look, yes, you want to engage your anchors, yes, you want to do anchor assessment, yes, you want to know what they're doing internally, but man, if you can get them working together, they can each hold each other accountable and bring resources together. And then also succession planning, right? University presidents turn over and priorities change.
So going forward, you talk about leadership at the top. Leadership at the top of the anchors, or leadership at the top of the city, or both?
Both.
And going forward with the initiative, are there I assume that you're going to educate us as a city and the anchors as to the things that we need to be mindful of so as to not to fall in and become the Seton Hall or the other places you've talked about?
I generally believe, Seton Hall, they were bad neighbors, I can say that. I was their neighbor. I would say that, I think, in my mind, when you think about anchor collaborators, or the idea of the practice of anchors, generally speaking, we all as a city, right, the city of Lynchburg for the last year has developed a comprehensive economic development strategy, right, based off of clusters, based off of improving quality of place, wanting to improve talent pools, all those things. And frankly, that's benefit for business, right? Typical business Joe, entrepreneur. It's important for government, right? We want to increase our tax base as much as we can to provide city services for our residents. I think that's what we want to do. We want to improve our quality of place and the opportunity for our residents to thrive, and anchor institutions should want those goals as well. And so the reason that, as we think about the vision, a lot of times that vision, right, really is in that 50-page document that we worked through for over 18 months, right? And so that vision is about thinking about how do you, if you are thinking about all the players on the field, and you're thinking about, which team, what is defense doing, what's offense doing, anchor institution is just another set of players that you're trying to figure out how do you leverage to advance this agenda along, right? Because your Office of Economic Development, which is well-staffed, well-resourced, and quite capable, cannot achieve that plan without their institutions working with them. It's just not possible.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, cheers.
Councilmember Perro?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. By the way, sorry, I sat on my tile in my pocket, which immediately alerted my phone saying, here I am, even though it was muted. Okay. So sorry about that. So there is an example of an anchor institution in history. I can think of actually lots in this region that got engaged and did affordable housing, actively engaged in affordable housing, and it went poorly. And those are mill towns. That's exactly what mill towns do. So I think we need to look at, as we do this, I think you're bringing forth some really good ideas, but you need to understand, or we need to understand, based on what the long-term impact is, how this works well, what hasn't worked in the past. And I don't think, I know that we should not tell any of our anchors what to do. Instead, we should find out what they need and help them. If there's something that they need, then we should help them advance to meet that goal. Not necessarily tell them how they should, certainly not tell them how they should run their business, but in order for them to be a community partner, and I agree with Mr. Wright, as far as how to do that, I think an MOU would be very simple and certainly allowable. And Mr. Heggleston's exactly right. We couldn't do a tit for tat on because of our proffer issues, but there certainly could be an MOU that would talk about city investment in a certain area if the anchor institution was willing to invest in an area that was meaningful for them as well. So I think we need to look at those opportunities.
You just described public-private partnerships in a way, right?
Yeah, I did.
You just described the birth of the Cornell Tech campus, for instance. I totally agree with you. You and I are on the same page. I don't think that it's the role of government to tell anchor institutions how to run their institutions, but there is this question about how can you improve the environment. If I was university president, not that I am, I would care a lot about the current environment because, frankly, it's part of the product that I'm selling along with my institution. So completely agree.
And how we can help them is the best way. And back to your earlier slide, it's not a philanthropic effort; it's an investment. It's a strategic investment with, as you said, a return on the investment for the locality. And hopefully, you can develop a win. And well, actually, the only way you're going to get a community partner if it is a win-win scenario. And we should be looking for those deals. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. The only other question might be for and note, I see Tech Hire in the audience. Who are we partnering with now as far as workforce and education and training of regional programs, connectivity? Are we partnering with our current anchors in any form right now?
Going to be part of this discussion, as well. Our partnerships right now have been directly with the businesses when it comes to Tech Hire, but I believe that we have made some inroads in having conversations with Liberty. They actually called us to ask about programs and workforce pipeline, and we've also talked with Centra. So what we're really hoping to do is it does all have to be a two-way street. It has to be something that the anchor, we want to help them because they are the major employers here. We want to help them, but they are going to have to want to partner with us, and I think there's a lot of great stuff going on, but we haven't formalized that or brought it to the top. So I think that this is going to be a long-term kind of relationship where we are constantly, discovering what are things that are needed. I've got major employers here besides the anchor institutions that are asking me, how do we partner with the schools here to make sure that we have a talent pipeline? But there's got to be a way to do that, whether it's Lynchburg City Schools, whether it's Liberty, whether it's Randolph, whether it's University of Lynchburg, CVCC. It's got to work for whatever system they have as well as the employer. So you are well aware how we struggle with the traditional workforce system sometimes, and how do we collaborate and get to the end goal, which is putting citizens in jobs. And how do we train citizens? How do we train them over and over and over again? And we've got great resources here to do that. So I think we have an incredible opportunity because of all the institutions that we have here to do some groundbreaking work. But it will be with all of us at the table. And I'll remind everybody that the steering committee for the Blueprint for Opportunity was made up of representatives from all of the anchor institutions. So as this came along, there was a representative from each one of those organizations that worked on the blueprint and became familiar with this terminology and with what we were looking at doing. So I really believe from the response that people are excited about what's next.
Thank you. Oh, Councilmember Wright.
I just want to say that not to do any kind of injustice to the roundabout conversation, but this is one of the most exciting presentations, I think, of the past year since I've been on council. I think this is tremendously exciting for the city. So thank you all for sharing this with us and doing all this work on it. Dr. Pettigo, you sort of mentioned that obviously it's critical to have stable leadership at the anchor institutions and then city government. And so I'm curious if you find that there's a difference in outcome based on the form of government in a particular jurisdiction. So for example, is a strong mayor system more effective or less effective than a council manager form of government?
Not necessarily, because I think what's interesting about anchor institutions is they as institutions can work with special improvement districts as well. So a lot of the stuff that I've talked about in Philadelphia, right, was done not through the city of Philadelphia or the mayor's office, but really was done through the special improvement district in West Philadelphia. There is examples of institutions playing that, city managers playing that role, or economic development organizations. The other thing to think about anchor institutions is that it doesn't necessarily even have to be collaborators that are facilitated through government. For instance, much of the Cleveland work, frankly, was facilitated through the Cleveland Foundation. And the foundation played an important role in terms of providing some of those initial dollars to build that strategy and get those things get that up. Example we'll talk about tomorrow in Minneapolis, a collaborative between some Minneapolis anchors was actually done through the Transit Authority there. There was a light rail investment that went along. The Transit Authority said, look, we need to get more housing and densification around that, get people to use the public investment that we had. So they partnered with the institutions there to get local healthcare and educational and cultural facility workers to live along light rail, frankly. So it can be multiple types of governments and 8 public agencies playing that role. Cool.
Thank you. No other questions? Thank you very much
Thank you all
for your
for having me.
presentation.
Good to meet you all.
Good luck tomorrow. Thank you. All right. It is, if there's nothing else, then we are adjourned. Recess until 7:30. Thank you very much.